It is tempting to think that more leadership or some kind of improved leadership will help us and our organizations work better. But what if leadership was part of the problem instead of the solution? What if our understanding of it only maintained principles of the past, which no longer serve us well? That's what I explore in my book, Dare to Unlead, and today in this podcast. Join me and my guest, a person quoted in the book or in tune with his values, to learn from them what it takes to unlead and succeed together. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Dare to Unlead podcast, where we explore some of the themes addressed in Dare to Unlead, the book. We started with the crisis of work and leadership in organizations that are often misunderstood for machines. But you can't fix a team or a business as you would repair a broken engine, because they really are living organizations, and that changes everything. What we need today is a reinvention of leadership, which can take place around 3 universal values. We covered the first one, liberty, in episodes 3 to 5 of this podcast. Susan Skrupski kicked off equality in episode 6. More precisely, equality in diversity. And what makes it possible? In my opinion, networks. Networks as technology and networks as operating principles. That's the topic of chapter 7, and that's what we're going to talk about today with my 2 guests. 2? Yes, for a change. Plus, not only is this multi-person conversation a good illustration of the topic, but my guests have a particular deep understanding of networks and how they change work and leadership. Jon Husband and Harold Jarche are familiar names to those interested in new forms of work. Both live in Canada, Montreal for Jon and Sackville, New Brunswick for Harold, almost all the way to the east. Jon is a thinker, a speaker, an advisor, involved in the deep sociological and psychological changes introduced by the network era. Prior to working on his own, Jon has been involved in some of the foundational elements of the management systems we know today, such as talent strategies, org design, job evaluations, compensations, and so on. He knows this stuff from within. Harold Jarche is also an advisor, a writer, speaker, and I love that from his LinkedIn profile, a keen subversive of the last century's management and training models. Harold spent 17 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, where he developed a passion for training, learning, everything knowledge, and most likely one of the fields that is most transformed by networks. Harold is an active blogger and a partner in the Internet Time Alliance, an international think tank focused on organizational learning and performance. I met Harold and Jon through, guess what? Social networks. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jon in person several times. I have a deep respect for their respective work. They provide, in my opinion, essential guideposts for navigating the present and future of work. I also admire their work ethic, the way they lead their lives in alignment with their values of open collaboration and knowledge sharing. Hasn't this become subversive indeed? Jon, Harold, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. I'm excited to hear from you today.
Thanks for having us.
So let me start with the question I ask each guest on this podcast. I'll start with you, Jon. Jon, what is your art, the professional practice that you would describe as unique to you or that you perform in a unique way? What is your art and what led you to this?
Excuse me. That's an interesting question, particularly as I approach, let's call it early old age, and look back on the twisting and winding path that got me here. I recently recommended to a fellow who I think is a common friend of ours, Johnny Moore, a book called Your Signature Path by a consultant by the name of Jeffrey Bellman, who talks about how what you do and the choices and decisions you make trace your signature through your life. And as I look back, I find myself increasingly probably because I'm independent, very much like the curious 18-year-old who went to university and began experiencing life outside of home. I think my art has become an enduring curiosity about human beings, why they do what they do, how they work, how they live, coupled with a very good and deep knowledge of the history of organizations, why people organize to do what they do, what motivates them, what keeps them going, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And to encompass that, and what led me eventually to study networks was the combination of that curiosity, that knowledge, and what I would call a Jesuit-like training in the applied methodologies that organizations are using. In other words, all of the basic tools of 20th century industrial era management science. The combination of those three led to significant disenchantment and disillusionment. But that's what I do. I watch and I recognize patterns, I think, earlier than many people, and put that against the background of where we've been for the last 100 years.
That's awesome. What about you, Harold? What's your art?
My art. Well, I'll start a little bit with the, you talked about me being a keen subversive of the last century's education and management models. That actually came from a reader. That I didn't make that up. So, somebody actually said, well, "This is what you do, Harold." So that's part of it. I came across a term this year, which I think describes me. So my wife has always said that I'm 10 to 20 years ahead of everybody else, which is why I've had certain challenges in running my own business, because people go like, "What the heck is this guy talking about?" And the term that I came across is called sentinel intelligence, and that there are some people who see they see the signs that a lot of other people don't see, and in some ways it's a curse. Because it's kind of like, well, how come you don't see this? Isn't this obvious? And I think that is one thing that I also bring to my clients, and I've been lucky to have a few clients who've actually appreciated that. But trying to find them is difficult. So I think that's the problem, being either a Cassandra or being a little too far out there. And but I think that is my unique talent.
I've been,
sure.
if it's any consolation, I've been called Cassandra a number of times in my working life as well.
And how did the two Cassandras of you got connected?
I actually dug through my blog posts to figure that one out, John.
And?
Well, it'd be the early 2000s, 2001 or 2002, I would think, when many of us had our hair on fire about the potential of these liberating tools in this liberating environment. I know that's a question that's coming up. One of the reasons why there was so much excitement is because there had been 50 years of growing anxiety about all of the different kinds of constraints placed on workers under evolved management science.
Yeah, and when I was looking through it, it was, I mean, we got connected through other bloggers and people that you mentioned, Johnny Moore, Rob Patterson, and a few others who were talking about how the web particularly is changing relationships, and particularly hierarchical relationships, and that's how we started connecting through them, because by 2001, I wasn't blogging, but I was reading a lot of blogs, and I was one of the few people commenting on the blogs, which was people weren't doing much commenting early on. And that's how I got to know a number of people, because kind of like, hey, you comment, you do that, connected. And so, yeah, so it's been a solid 20 plus years that John and I have known each other.
Yeah, and that leads to my next question. Precisely, the internet is considered to be officially born in 1983 somehow, and soon after came the first online virtual communities. So, do you remember when and how you got involved in digital networks, John?
Yes, I do very clearly. In keeping with what I said before about my curiosity, I had been reading a lot in the mid-'80s about the coming information age and the knowledge age and so on. And so I was aware that there was this thing called the internet, and that in fact, I think I still have it around somewhere, a Fortune magazine with a cover about this thing called the internet coming. And at the date of publication of that particular issue of Fortune magazine, there were only 74 websites on the planet. So, and they were wondering if this thing was going to stick around. And then came sort of the dot-com boom and the dot-com bust right at the end, and that was around the time I came up with the notion of Wirearchy. But also, I was involved in a number of the early networks like Tribe, Friendster, Orkut. I was also paying attention to what is a topic of considerable discussion these days, natural language processing back then, as I was involved in designing and building a piece of software for blogging called Cumana. So yeah, I was pretty actively involved in the first 5 years of the 2000s.
That's awesome. And how about you, Harold?
Yeah, so I come from a very non-techie background. As a matter of fact, you could almost call me a modern Luddite in my early years. I had no interest in this. I took a computer programming course in 1979, and I failed. And the professor called me in, and he said, "What are you majoring in?" I said, "History." He said, "Are you planning on taking another computing course?" I said, "No." He said, "All right, you pass. Get out of here." and that was a course in Fortran using punch cards. So that's like 79, and then leap forward to 1993, and I just transferred and became a training specialist in the military, and I got posted to an Air Force unit, and we had just purchased 100 new helicopters, and my job was to design all the training, and we were getting in, and I had to understand computer-based training because we had this new thing coming, and flight simulation, and so it was like, you got to learn about technology whether you like it or not, buddy. And I did, and I was stationed in Montreal at the time, and there was this place called a Window on Technology in downtown Montreal, I went there because I was just getting started on a master's in education, and I went there with a friend of mine, and we saw this thing on a computer, and it showed a website, and a light went on because the website was in Germany. And it was kind of like, I can post something in Canada, somebody in Germany can read it, vice versa. And the light went on saying, this is going to change everything because anybody can post anything and they can share anything everywhere. And I became sort of a web network evangelist that minute. And so that would have been in early 1994.
And you were right. This changed everything, including the power structures. So now come the big question, Jon, about Wirearchy. What is Wirearchy?
Well, it's I think on purpose. First of all, it's just a made-up word. Just to be clear about that. That myself and then a few other people have imparted some meaning to through the definition of it, and on purpose have always left it just as a definition of an emergent principle, because I'm not sure that it's makeable into any particular method, although a little bit later I'll probably talk about how I think I see it all around us. But to continue on with sort of the story I started, I had ended up by the year 2000, having spent about 15 years as a management consultant working with mainly the tools or the methods for developing the different levels in organization charts and the compensation strategies and the performance management strategies that went along with that. And the company I worked for was the dominant provider or user, the provider of these methods to large organizations all around the world. And it's a method that was derived in the 50s. It's very, very clever, but it's very industrial, engineering-based, very logical, very straightforward, based on inputs, throughputs, and outputs, and really codified, I think, generically in terms of the definitions that are used in the method, virtually all of Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management. And by the time mid '90s rolled around, I had been reading a lot about emerging knowledge management, living organizations, organizational learning, Peter Senge's work, Ari Degusa's work, all sorts of other people. Again, remembering that I'm curious about people and why they do what they do. And I ended up quitting the management consulting company, which was very, very traumatic for me, just as I had turned 40. And it really kind of blew up my life, but I couldn't see myself continuing in that firm with those old methods when I thought something so exciting as this information age and the era of networks was coming at us. So I ended up quitting, and then a few years later, I was in the middle of the dot-com boom, and I was actually reading an article, or had just read an article by Peter Drucker titled Beyond the Information Age. And the last 7 paragraphs, which is a section, is titled Bribing the Knowledge Workers. And in it, he basically said, eventually, in the economy that we're moving into, those who are knowledge workers who produce the value out of knowledge and information are going to be the ones who own the means of production. And once they realize that, and a significant number of them realize that, then power shifts begin to happen with respect to traditional hierarchies. And I went, aha, and the light went on. And actually it was the next day when I was in the shower, I was thinking about this new magazine that had come out, Wired magazine, and I was thinking about what is the archy, or the architecture, the rules and the principles for living and working in this wired information age that's coming at us. And I just, wire, it sounded like hierarchy, wirearchy, bang, and I knew what I meant. And I went out and wrote it down. Again, I had the benefit of probably 25 years of studying organizations and, things like stocks and flows of knowledge and, where knowledge comes from, how information is used, and so on. And wirearchy, the definition came to me that day. It's a dynamic flow of power and authority based on knowledge, trust, credibility, and a focus on generating value. Now, one of the things I've been asked 100 times or 1,000 times is, isn't that kind of too generic? But if you think of what's going on with the several billion of us connected now, whether it's dystopian or whether it's utopian, what's involved we are constantly exchanging quote unquote knowledge, and we are building or losing trust and credibility, as the case may be. Many books could be written about each of these subjects, but these are general headings to inform a principle. And I think it's that these are in play. If we look around us, the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, well, knowledge, power, and credibility and trust are in play. In many instances today, what circulates online creates opinion, whether it's correct and based on fact or not. And opinion is what creates energy for action. And we have this kind of ongoing tug of war that I don't expect is going to end anytime soon. It's just going to continue to evolve as we learn how to work with it, deal with it, master it, learn from the very large mistakes that will be made, and so on. So, it's really a principle based on the exchanges of information and what will be built out of that, whether it's for the better or for the worse, and there will be examples of both.
I think the first time I heard this definition, I think it was maybe 10, 12 years after you coined that term, it felt like absolutely self-evident. It resonated so much with what I was perceiving from changes happening or being prevented precisely in organizations, because it's new, it's a completely new way of working, new way of operating, of interrelating, and it can feel scary. Jon, do you mean that with Wirearchy, or with the advent of this new era, does it mean that job titles, reporting structures, hierarchical power, etc., all things expressed in org charts, is now meaningless or not?
I don't think so. No, I don't think they're meaningless. I think that what existed before, or what still exists in many, if not most cases, which is a classic organization chart with boxes that have job titles in them, and then underneath, somewhere in the files of each worker and each human resources department, there are additional documents that'll go along with, your KPIs or your OKRs, your performance objectives, your salary range, the different competencies you're expected to have, and the competency models that attach to those, and so on. I don't think those are meaningless. They have been a set of tools to implement, a general thesis, if you will, or ethos of management science. But I think that because of the much more rapidly moving workplace now, these things will change in terms of their intent and perhaps their use. I'm reminded of a presentation from the mid-90s that I saw at a conference in Seattle of something called the World at Work Association, which used to be the American Compensation Association. And there was a man, I think he may be dead now, called William Bridges, who wrote a book about transitions, and others. It was quite a famous book at the time, particularly for as people began losing their jobs more frequently and making transitions to other careers. But in it, he put out a 4x4 diagram where he talked about the relationship between people who work for a company and the company, and noted that alumni of the company, outside contractors, consultants, and so on are also now an integral part of a company. They just have differing kinds of relationships structured on different agreements, out of which I wrote an essay, I think a long time ago, called Our Agreements Are Our Structures, because what we've agreed to is, the job descriptions and performance kits that are around us in the org charts. So I think all of those things are going to change. They've been used typically as almost like a subway map or a map of a city where you're looking at a human organization, and this is the way things officially are supposed to work. What we all know is that there's an awful lot that goes on in the white space of organization charts, or in workarounds, or in people that are dissatisfied with their titles, often because a different title would give them more money and put them in a different salary range, which is what a lot of consulting is about, actually. But I think they're around to stay. They're going to become more flexible. I think jobs are going to come to be seen, or are already seen, as roles instead of jobs, so that they can be redefined more easily. So these things are not going to go away. They're going to get retooled. They will also be retooled because many organizations now use software platforms to manage much of the information about the employment relationship.
Harold, what does Wirearchy mean today? Why does it matter?
Well, I mean, I think I've written a number of posts on Wirearchy and pretty well incorporated it into my own work. But when you think about it, is that more and more of the work that we're dealing with is or the situations are complex or even chaotic, right? I mean, we're still going through a pandemic. There's a major war going on in Eastern Europe. Climate change is having huge impacts, all that kind of stuff. And what we do know is that what Wirearchy puts forth, this idea of a two-way flow of trust and information and knowledge, is that it's only when information flows fast that we can make better decisions, right? So I mean, and I say that knowledge flows at the speed of trust. So which basically incorporates the Wirearchy organizing principle, and too many of our organizations are structured around being able to deal with what Dave Snowden calls the ordered domains, when it's clear or it's complicated, right? And so, and that's why we have these job roles. But to deal with complexity or even chaos is what we need are much looser, what I call temporary negotiated hierarchies. So somebody's got to be in charge. Okay, today you're in charge, Harold. Tomorrow, Jon, you're in charge, right? Because the situation is different. And so you need to be able to have that ability to reorganize very quickly. But you also need to have strong networks to know where you can get the right information at the right time from. So, and then when you go back to Wirearchy, you say, okay, yeah, this is an organizing principle, right? And from that, we can then build different organizational models.
Harold has built some years ago a very interesting diagram where he took essentially what's recognized as the Cynefin framework symbol of 4+1 areas, the center being disorder, the center area. But laying on top of that, I think it's Verna Ali's work on value networks, where you get this notion of different looseness and tightness of hierarchies depending upon the situations that you find yourself in. And I think one of the things that's interesting, given that we're talking about Wirearchy now, is that two things that have really stayed with me. One is the rise of awareness of complexity and complex adaptive systems. And the fundamental issue of complexity is that different parts are in interaction, are in motion, whereas the underlying assumption in the previous era of industrial things meant that there was often a fixed sequence of tasks that produce an outcome. So it's a very different notion as opposed to all sorts of different parts of, let's say, a knowledge network interacting with each other. And out of that emerges, appropriate responses that are scaffolded into eventually an appropriate response or not. So this notion of the complexity becoming more tangible, more in our awareness, I think is compounded by the fact that we haven't really gotten into the topics like PKM or working out loud, where so much more of what we do has a number of defining characteristics that weren't there before. They're visible all the time on a screen. They're searchable. They're linkable. You can do much, much more with this information once you know where you're navigating. And what's really important to keep in mind is that with all this interaction, it brings placing things into context to the fore always. If I could say anything, adopting that real estate maxim of location, location, location for networks, it's context, 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 always context. And in fact, if you look at the notions of complex adaptive systems and Dave Snowden's and others' work, when you move into less certain, more complex conditions, you are seeking to find what are the constraints and what are the boundaries that operate such as to allow you to both, first of all, understand and get a handle on what's going on, and then respond in appropriate or intelligent ways.
And it is said that the advent of networks signals the end or the beginning of the end of autocratic top-down management. Harold, is the democratization of work something we should aim for? If yes, why and where do we start?
Yeah, well, I talked about what we need, that knowledge flows at the speed of trust, and that you have to, and if you think about the requirement to form and reform who we work with and how we work together, is that democracy where everyone is an equal or has some equality really gives you much more agility. And if you think about a structured hierarchical organization, it is only as smart as the individual at the top. So that's a huge limitation, right? One thing that I put forward in terms of leadership is that leadership is helping make your network smarter. Is helping them make better decisions. And if you think about that from the term, from the perspective of our elites in many of our democracies, is that they haven't helped make their network smarter. They haven't helped to make their communities smarter. And what happens is that you start getting decisions such as we had here in Canada, the trucker convoy protest that wanted to actually get rid of a democratically elected prime minister because they figured that they had the right to do that. They didn't even understand understand how Canada is governed. And so, if you dumb down the networks around you, they're going to be making decisions that maybe aren't in your best interest. So again, that the democratization of knowledge, I think, becomes essential to be able to address the complex things that we really need to. And we don't have enough of those deep conversations about these fuzzy, unfixable, unmanageable types of things that we have to deal with anyway. And some kind of democratically organized structure, I think, is the only one that's going to allow that information to flow as fast as it can. And we saw that outside of government in the initial days of the pandemic when we didn't have a vaccine, and how scientists in China and in Europe and the U.S. and Africa they were throwing stuff out there online for people to take a look at, and that's how they were able to sequence the gene, and then they were able to start developing the mRNA vaccines, and that was through open democratic. No one was really in charge of it, and they were just throwing it out. And now we seem to have reverted back at the other end of the pendulum right now, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If I could add
Yeah.
to what Harold said around the question of the end of top-down autocratic management, I would say no, that we're not going to see the end of top-down management. However, I would say that conditions of, let's call it Wirearchy, sharpen the game for leaders in terms of, being seen and being heard to walk their talk, which has always been right at the top of the flip chart lists of what's not going well around here. But I do think what is, and it'll take longer, it'll partly generational. I think we will see the end of the autocratic part of top-down management. So you'll have much more of feedback and listening loops going on. However, I do think that there will be, places where autocratic management take root. I would say, for example, that in the absence of further knowledge about it, what Elon Musk is doing at Twitter would be called arguably autocratic management. And a cute way of looking at that is borrowing the term from the accounting domain of FIFO, which is first in, first out, and making it instead, as opposed to applied to the organization, as first in or fit in or fuck off. Because there's going to be a lot of that, and the corollary to that is our colleague Jane McConnell's book of many more people, and I think this is a trend that won't go away, think of themselves as gig workers. I'm here for this gig, and what's the next gig, and so on and so forth, whether it's inside the organization or outside the organization or both.
And Jon, how do we resolve conflict in a network when precisely there's no boss deciding for the rest of us?
Well, I think that's a very, very interesting question. I think that one of the things that these network conditions puts into play in a very important way is the notion of decision making, and it's coupled to Harold's notion of knowledge flows at the speed of trust. There's an awful lot of knowledge that is stopped being put into action because of the protocols and the policies and the guidelines in place at a given organization and the penalties for going outside those guardrails. I don't know what the answer is to collaborative decision making, particularly on large scales. There are a number of schools of practice, I would say, involved in what's called large scale change. And I think your friend Myron Rogers has done a fair bit of that kind of work, where there are ways to get large groups of people together, put issues on table, work them out with the help usually of facilitators, and then gather what has been worked out by a diverse and inclusive set of processes to say, here's what we're looking at, what should we do about it. I would also think that a lot of Dave Snowden's recent work in the last 2 or 3 years has been about different kinds of both what he calls assemblages and processes to put those into place that seek out diversity of opinion and inclusion of different viewpoints in order to capture might not be the right word, process as much of the complexity as possible in a given context. But in terms of, is there a method for making decisions amongst large groups of people with diverse sources of information, knowledge, and opinion? I don't think so. There will be group processes, and a number of the people that we all know already work with those.
And to make decisions, we need to form opinions. That may be the point where we get to PKM. Harold, what does PKM stand for, and why does it matter, and how do we develop the skills we need in the world of today?
Yeah, first, speaking of opinions, one of my mantras is strong opinions, loosely held. And I think that, which is part of the whole notion of perpetual beta, is that all of our models that we use to inform us are in beta. We need to use them to make decisions, and but we also have to be able to discard them if they're no longer useful. So PKM, which was called, or is called, personal knowledge management. And I've developed a framework, and I use the term personal knowledge mastery, and I'll explain why. For me, it came out of, I guess you'd call it creative desperation. So 2003, I lost my job, and here I am. You said I'm in Sackville, New Brunswick, at the time population 5,000, only 1,000 kilometers to Jon's house. So it's a little ways away from Montreal, and 1,000 kilometers down to Boston. I lost my job. There was no real work in the area, and I decided, well, consulting is something that I've done and something I understand. I understand these learning technologies and stuff like that. But I couldn't afford to fly to conferences and pay the fees and stuff like that. And I had to figure out, okay, well, how the heck am I going to stay current? And so I started researching on the web, and I started blogging and things like that. And I came across this thing called personal knowledge management, particularly from Lilia Filmova, who was doing her PhD at the time in the Netherlands, and Denham Gray, who I think was working for IBM at the time, and Dave Pollard, who was with Ernst & Young. And they were all talking about this PKM thing, which is like, how do I organize my information, make sense of it, and sort of get going? And I just started writing about it and going back and forth and stuff like that, and trying different ideas. And more, it was more me working out loud, learning out loud, without even using that term. And some other people connected with me on the blog on that, and like the conversations about Wirearchy with Jon. And over time, the first thing that really hit me was because I started in about 2004 writing about it, and I think it was 2007 or 2008 that Domino's Pizza contacted me, their head of leadership, and I said, "Been reading about this PKM thing. Could you run a workshop, and could we incorporate it into our leadership program?" I go, "Sure," because it wasn't even a thing, right? And then it developed over time, and now I call it personal knowledge mastery because I wanted to get away from the KM world, which is KM was a lot of top-down stuff, right? It was knowledge management. We're going to build these repositories. We've got these systems like Cognizant or whatever. And for me, it's about every person trying to, how am I going to seek out the information and the connections, the human connections that I need? So that's the seek. What do I do to make sense? Because if you're not doing anything with this stuff, you're collecting a whole bunch of stuff, and it's just stuff, right? So what am I doing to actually make sense of this? And then what am I doing to share that at the appropriate times? And that's the whole notion of leadership and networks, is helping make the network smarter. So I'm trying to share at the appropriate time with the appropriate people, and maybe help them get their work done. And so PKM has kind of progressed along that, and I guess in some ways I'm known as the PKM guy now. Not that was ever the intent, but we've run the programs. I just finished developing a program called Working Smarter at City. We finished that in 2020, and it's based on the PKM framework: curiosity, seeking, sensing, and sharing. City is running 5,000 people a quarter through the program, and because they realized that collaboration wasn't happening between departments or between, like, as Jon had mentioned, the greater network, suppliers, consultants, and things like that. And so that program has been very successful in terms of how it's received. And it's an informal and social learning program. It's not a check the box and answer the questions and do things like that. So the proof is in the pudding that the framework, the structure makes sense to a lot of different people. And for me, it really has become my own sense-making framework. And the core for me is my blogging, right? And which I just celebrated my 19th blogiversary 2 days ago. So
Amazing.
Congratulations.
And
If
you
I,
run
if I,
you run PKM courses, and I enrolled in one of them and can only recommend people to check that out because they are really extremely useful, I find.
if I can
For
add, if I
yeah,
can add to both your
Jon.
testimony and Harold's, I consider PKM an absolutely fundamental and essential skill for operating in not only a Wirearchy, but let's call it tomorrow's networked conditions for everybody. I think it's the kind of thing that everybody should get at least an introductory course to it before they get out of high school, because we're spending all day on our screens every day, surrounded by and penetrated by flows of information, and it's only going to get more intense, more frequent. And so having this skill is a survival skill, and it's also a skill for, I think, participating responsibly in networks of knowledge where people are trying to get things done.
yeah,
So,
and PK Mastery is quite different than a lot of other PKM products and processes that are sold out there because there isn't a recipe and there's no technology. And what it's about is discovering through trial and error what works for you and then developing your own way of practicing it. So everyone practices PK Mastery differently. There's no and that is a real challenge in terms of selling it. And also the initial learning curve for a lot of people is kind of like, well, just give me the answers, give me the recipe, and there isn't one.
what I know that Harold has written about this, and I have as well. There's a principle that's been operational since IT came on the scene, let's say 50 years ago, called mass customization, which is making things personalized to people or to a group, but it's something that's done by large masses of people. And arguably, Harold's invention of PK Mastery is a way to tailor and customize your relationship with information and knowledge to put it to work for you, whether it's within a knitting group or a bunch of rocket scientists trying to develop a new form of uranium fuel or something like that. But it's just a way of mass customizing for yourself and your group all of this information and knowledge that flows by and finding ways to put it to practical use.
Yeah, because
So we're-
PKM is used in, I mean, it's used, like I mentioned, Citibank, but it's also used for a listening and learning community for parents of deaf children. And again, Domino's Pizza, the NHS, it informed their strategic plan on how people share knowledge and stuff like that. So it is flexible that
Yeah.
way.
It,
The challenge is it's work.
it's modern literacy, I would say.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes,
And
network literacy.
yeah, so we're coming to the end, unfortunately, of this conversation, which I could keep going for another couple of hours. Let me ask just a few last questions. Jon, there's a growing disenchantment towards the effect of social networks on society. It was hoped that they would support diversity in our global village. Now it seems quite different 30 years later. Have networks failed us?
No, I don't think so. I think that what we're seeing is this might sound presumptuous, but has been largely predictable. And I remember, bloggers, some of whom are dead now, early bloggers, who were very knowledgeable, some of the Clue Train authors, for example, the Clue Train Manifesto, talking about the ravaging effects that commercializing everything would have. So, something that's bothered many people, including what's his name? Tim, help me here. Tim
Berners-Lee?
Yeah, Tim Berners-Lee, who's been working supposedly for the last few years on a new type of network called Solid, is that advertising is the financial engine for all of these networks. And I keep in my tabs, in fact, I have it out here right now, an essay from George Monbiot from a number of years ago called Sucking Out Our Souls Through Our Eyes, which is basically about the pernicious effects of advertising on us. And if I can slide just to the side for a moment, I just came back from 3 weeks at an all-inclusive resort perched on an absolutely wonderful site with 2 beaches in the Dominican Republic. But watching all of the other people there and listening to them, they're mainly from Canada and from Germany, I keep hearing all over and seeing on the streets. It feels sometimes like I'm walking through all the commercials that we see on TV and on Facebook and wherever else. So there's been this sort of paving over of paradise, where I mentioned earlier that I think when social networks first came onto the scene, we felt like they were liberating because, as Harold said, you can actually share something with somebody in Germany or Poland or Japan, and you can eventually, there was Skype, you could talk to them, you could do all this connecting, and there were a bunch of visionaries, including John Perry Barlow, that wrote about the freedom of information and so on and so forth. But we've seen the pernicious effects of the only way that you could get money to scale to be as large as Facebook or Twitter was to go through an IPO, and then you know who controls the IPOs, which are the venture capitalists and the big brokerage houses and so on. However, I think networks are here to stay. I think we've all seen early patterns of smaller groups that are private, that trust each other. For example, the 3 of us are part of at least one, if not others, groups like that. Harold has a trust group that he has operated for a number of years called Perpetual Beta Coffee Club. We're seeing significant intentions to move off of Twitter and off of Facebook. There will be commercial pressures for them. There will be more and more, I think, open protocol platforms eventually. People will, the sociology of this, particularly given it's such a major shift, kind of like an earthquake to the world of information, because we're surrounded in it and surrounded by it and bathe in it now, is that the sociology of how to come to terms with it, how to use it for better purposes, if you will, and for more effective purposes, will still be there. And in fact, the crises that continue to dominate our lives may make it such that they become inevitably useful tools for coping with a world of continuous complexity. I don't think they're going away. I think they have reflected to us who we are. It's not the tools that are causing all the uproar. It's anonymous imbeciles, including us. The notions of anonymity make it a lot easier to say stupid things when you might not if you're at a backyard barbecue. So I don't think they've failed us. I think they're still, toddlers or young teens in terms of maturing in terms of how we use them.
And Harold, how can organizations make the best of networks?
I think, organizations, there was a great book that you and Semple wrote called Organizations Don't Tweet, People Do. And I think organizations can make the best use of networks when leadership starts reaching out and networking, starts practicing. It's what I've noticed that particularly in the learning sphere or in knowledge management is that if you want to have more collaboration, you want to have more cooperation, I differentiate the two, is that the leadership has to sort of practice it, and because it's leadership by example, and we know that that humans learn much more through modeling than they do through what's called shaping. So, in other words, you have a formal training program, it has nowhere near the impact of the modeled behavior within the organization. So I think it's when the leadership starts connecting outside, when they start sharing knowledge, the two-way flow of trust and information starts happening. Because in all of the analyses that I have done in organizations over the years, is that the problem is management. Is that if you fix management, you fix the organization. So
I agree completely with Harold. Tom Peters wrote many years ago about managing by walking around. So I remember Harold and I were talking about managing by blogging around, but participating in the social networks in a real and authentic way helps build trust and credibility. Period.
Yeah, I mean, that's how Jos de Blok, who created Bergzorg, which is the nursing care organization that is very decentralized. It's groups of 12 nurses that organize the area that they're responsible for. And they have an internal blogging platform, and that's how Jos manages the organization, is that he puts a blog post out there. By noon, there are 500 responses, and some of them are saying, that's the stupidest idea you ever came up with, Jos. Let's just get on with it. But that's how he's constantly in touch with what's going on, and he's getting the feedback from the nurses who are on the ground and who are very much empowered, because I mean, Bergzorg is a very flat organization, and a lot of nurses can't handle the freedom that they get, because they also have the responsibility that comes with the freedom. So yeah, you can actually manage an organization through blogging.
Now, I want to close this conversation by paying tribute to someone you have both known and met, Esko Kilpi, who was an amazing thinker of work and digital leadership, and who's quoted many times in Dare to Unlead. To Kilpi, work and leadership is an interaction. And I mentioned that the raw material of collaborative work is the exchange of information, not the information itself. So big warm thoughts to his family and to everyone who has been inspired by this amazing thinker. Now, my last question to both of you will be: what would you say to someone who hasn't read Dare to Unlead yet, apart from read it? Jon?
Dare to Unlead is a highly personal story of Celine's experience with the world of work and herself in that world of work, and her signature path through that world of work has led her to seek out and earn a deep understanding of the dynamics of work, both in the old world and in the new and emerging world. So she has done a great job of putting that together in a very accessible style that also goes deep into these issues. So yes, read it.
Harold?
Yes, well, I agree with Jon. I feel the same thing. Is that I think the real sweet spot of Dare to Unlead is that it's a personal story. It's not an academic going out there researching, these are all the traits of leadership and unleadership and things like that and putting it together. But it's your story, right? And then in addition to that, as you said, that Esko is quoted several times within that, and so are a whole bunch of other people. And I think that weaving together all of those stories and making it personal. I mean, this crap that this is business, it's not personal, that we have heard over the years, which is total crap, because it is personal, because we are people, because we either need to work in the organization, we are in the organization, and people in leadership positions, I don't call them leaders, people in leadership positions, right, have a responsibility, and they have a huge impact on other people. And that's why, again, that's what I really like about your book, Celine, is that, yeah, it's personal and it's great.
The second time I got fired, the meeting started with, it's not personal, it's just business.
Yeah. And I'm sure it felt pretty darn personal.
Well, thank you so much, Jon, Harold. This book is a network, and you are both illuminating this network with your perspectives, your brio and insights, and foresight, I would say. So thank you so much for having been in this conversation. We will post all links, all resources in the we will post all resources under the podcast, and people will be able to find you and explore your work more if they're interested, and I'm sure they will be. Thank you so much. Great insights. Thank you all for listening. You'll find more info in Dare to Unlead, the book, and all links in the podcast episode description. And now, what else? Action! To explore further and apply these ideas to your own context, reach out to me at weneedsocial.com. Let's unlead together.